One of the aspects of the growth of the Zionist movement in the United States, as I had briefly mentioned with Zach, is that it was financial based. Norman Finkelstein, who is a friend of the show and somebody we think very highly of, lost his family in the Holocaust. But as he tells it, there's a lot of people who claim to have been in the Holocaust, but actually weren't. That's one of the dirty secrets, if you will. And one of the leading figures of the Zionist movement post-World War II was a man by the name of Elie Wiesel. So Candace and Mr. Finkelstein get into this very hot button topic, but very relevant topic in terms of the origins and growth of the post-World War II Zionist movement in the United States.
There are two crucial facts. One, I don't consider it crucial. The estimates by the best historians are between 5.2 and 5.4 million Jews were killed. It doesn't make much of a difference. Let's say it wasn't, but let's say it was 3 million. That doesn't make it better, obviously. Okay, but the estimates are between 5.2 and 5.4. Now, coming to your question. The Nazi extermination was very efficient. You can use a slur and say it was done with German efficiency. And to some extent, there's a truth to that. You know, what makes a cliche is it's most of the time true. What is a generalization? A generalization is something that's generally true. What's a stereotype? A stereotype is a generalization that you don't like. If you say Jews are smart, Jews like that generalization. If you say something else about Jews, that's a stereotype. But the Germans carried out the Nazi extermination with great efficiency. Why is that important? There were very few survivors. Now, Candace, I'm not trying to, I don't have an axe to grind. I'm just telling you factually. You take my mother. She had 2 sisters and a brother. They were exterminated. She had a mother and father. They were exterminated. My father, I don't know the details, but I know for sure he had 1 sister and 1 brother. These were taboo subjects in my home. Can't talk about them. So I don't know the details. I know they were wiped out. One of the reasons I wasn't bar mitzvahed, I did not have a bar mitzvah. And you know why? I mean, there are many reasons. My parents were resolute atheists. But one of the reasons was there was no one to invite. You see, a bar mitzvah is a big family event. The cousins, the aunts, the uncles, and so forth. Of course, the person being bar mitzvah invites his or her friends, or it's his friends. The person being bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. But the big thing, it's a family occasion. There was no one to invite. There was no one to invite because the Nazi extermination was very efficient.
It's a moment of reflection. And from Norman's perspective, as he said, the Holocaust was not talked about in his home. It was rather a chapter of the world that one would have to put aside in order to be able to avoid the grief of having to live through that. And so you can understand why, of all of the Jewish voices in the United States, that is against the state of Israel, and especially against their genocide, he's probably the most prominent of them all. He lived it. He's still living it. And the Zionists are desecrating his family's memory in the worst ways possible. It is too painful, but it must be discussed.
So the estimates are, at the end of World War II, the estimates are less than 100,000 Jews survived the Nazi Holocaust. Less than 100,000. So that means, where did all these survivors come from? Everybody claims there was a period when the Holocaust industry was in full, was very lucrative. There was a period where everybody claimed to be a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
And that is, in essence, where the true birth of the Zionist movement became a primary fixture within the United States, and ultimately, within just 3 years, the creation of the State of Israel commenced. It also marked the creation within that year of the Central Intelligence Agency. There are no coincidences. This was always a plan. Think of as an example, post 9/11, the passing of the Patriot Act. When I was in Dallas, I went to George W. Bush's presidential library. Patriot Act was featured prominently in what was a not so very large presidential library. But I will say this. Most of the things that we see that come to fruition were passed as a result of a cataclysmic circumstance. They were always there, salivating for a chance to get it done. And now they had their chance. And so, post-World War II survivorship, claiming, or in this case, what I would consider a form of stolen valor, very profitable, as we will continue to hear from Norman.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, they all claim to be Holocaust survivors. They weren't Holocaust survivors. There was a person who...
I actually think they were, but I fear they were survivors of another Holocaust that was going on at the same time, and they may have been, in part, executing it, which is a question that Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes, which is, where did all the Bolsheviks go? And I think, and this is again a theory, while we're allowed to think, well, this is a good opportunity right now to take on the identity of people who perished and just rewrite history of ourselves as the victims. And when I saw that Nicholas Gruner story, I was like, that's so terrifying, because it's required reading coming up in schools. You have to read the story. There's tons of Holocaust people that we could be reading your books, talking about your parents and what they lived through, and they picked this man. And
there was, look, I will get to the Elie Wiesel. I know well. In fact, I'm not trying to promote the book. It came out 25 years ago, but I write a lot about Elie Wiesel in the book. Okay. So, I remember my father, we both knew a person who had the tattoo. The only place there were tattoos were Auschwitz.
Auschwitz,
It was the only camp where they had the tattoos. And I said to my father about this person, and my father had the tattoo. I always knew the number. It was like 028128, something like that. I had memorized the number, but now I've forgotten it. I said to my father, I said, do you think he was in Auschwitz? And my father said, no. And my father was not a conspiracy person.
yeah.
No, he just said very matter-of-factly, non-judgmentally. He just said no. And I said to my father, I asked my father, so where did he get the number? And my father said, and I'm quoting him now, he said, well, after the war, some people took it off and some people put it on.
I know there's not many moments of levity to actually have a chuckle because there's nothing funny about claiming you survived the death camps when you didn't actually survive them. You just claimed that you were there. As one of the members of the chat mentioned, Elie Wiesel apparently is somebody who doesn't even exist. The person who claimed to be him stole that person's identity to use it for their own financial and political gain after the war was over. So that should not come as any surprise. And if Wiesel was doing that, you can imagine there were many others that did it too.
But he didn't say it as a joke.
Yeah, he's just like, this is
the
incentive here is to have one.
Yes,
yeah, it's bad.
yes.
It's incentives. It's incentive culture, obviously. That's
So,
what this is welfareism. If you're going to incentive bad behavior, people are going to do it.
Yes, I without going into that because that was on tangent, but yes. And my father said very matter-of-factly. So my mother used to get very frustrated because even more so than my father, she could never let go of what happened to her family. She couldn't let go. And there was something that really more than grated on her when people who didn't pass through what she passed through claimed to have passed through it. And she once exclaimed in a kind of bitter irony, she said, if everybody who claims to be a Holocaust survivor actually is one, who did Hitler kill?
We see a lot of that today, and we see a lot of it as it pertains to the genocidal state of Israel. People claim that that land is theirs because it's written in the Bible, and that it is heresy to question it. When in reality, their whole belief system is heresy, full stop. All of it is made up. The whole concept of Israel, the whole concept of Zionism, they used the deaths of at least 5.25 million people who were put to death in death camps all over Eastern Europe, predominantly in Poland. And today, they still bring it up. Much like the clip I did of Tommy Robinson, who went to his humiliation ritual with one of the Zio-Nazi scum suckers, saying, I have this giant book, 6 million words in it, and there's only one word, Jew. You think that's not propaganda? You think that's not massive manipulation of historic record? I think so. When you have people behaving that way, and you realize the depths of which they will go to denigrate the history of that time, sure. You're going to have millions of people that are going to say, it didn't happen. They just made it up. Zionism is what has created anti-Jewish sentiment in the modern era. Full stop.
So everybody's claiming to be a Holocaust survivor. There are very few, a handful survived that ordeal. Now,
especially particularly in Auschwitz, because there's so many were like, well, you said the tattoo.
There were the death camps, and then there were the concentration camp death camps. There were both work camps, and Auschwitz and Majdanek. I once spoke to the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who was very kind to me. He was of your political persuasion. He was a right-wing Republican. He swore by the Wall Street Journal. I was at the other end of the spectrum. and I was a total pariah. However, don't ask me why, because I've never really understood it. He kept defending me. I was always very nervous around him. I didn't want to say anything wrong because he was kind of my savior. He was saying that what Finkelstein is writing is true. And when the tenure battle erupted at DePaul University, he gave this very moving defense of me. And he said that I told the truth. It was at a very big price, he said. But he said, in the history of those writing about history, Finkelstein's place is secure. In any event, I once asked him, he lived in Vermont. He taught at the University of Vermont. He was very much his own person, so he could never get a job at a top university. He said, very few women survived Majdanek. That's where my mother was. Very few people. So it was worse, actually. The women's section was worse than at Auschwitz.
One of the reasons I suspect, and I take Finkelstein at his word in pretty much every case, if you're not up to snuff on what went on in many ways in the women's prisons during the Holocaust, it's pretty sick. And part of the reason I think it was tougher for them than perhaps for some of the men is because so much of what these camps were driven by was slave labor, being able to perform tasks, physically draining and taxing tasks that were probably harder on women than they were on men. And I still don't think that gets covered enough. And there were some pretty heinous Nazi guards that were women. Reading up on that is pretty disturbing as well. So it's never easy, I'm sure, for Norman to talk about this. But he does it with such conviction, with such candor, with such eloquence. And the patience he has is even more incredible. I always like listening to what he has to say, always. I feel like I'm listening to the type of professor that I would have loved to have had when I was at Rutgers University.
In any event, once the Holocaust industry became an industry, they were very picky about who they promoted. Now, Elie Wiesel was a fanatical supporter of Israel. He was fanatically pro anything that any American government would say. And so he became the spokesperson for the Holocaust. As to his personal history, I'm just going to give you the details as I understand them, okay? He claims he was in Auschwitz. He claimed that he was in Auschwitz. And he describes in the book Night, he describes some scenes which Raoul Hilberg, the person I mentioned to you from the person who defended me and for reasons which still remain, except integrity, which is so rare. He was the chief historian for the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. Elie Wiesel personally picked him because Wiesel knew his stuff. And he said there were certain scenes that Wiesel describes in Night that occurred at Auschwitz. Wiesel, Hilberg said they could not have happened. They could not
without question,
happened.
It didn't happen. You
And
read Nicholas
so
Gruner, yeah. It's like...
when Wiesel was confronted with Hilberg saying they happened, he doubled down and said they did happen. Wiesel, I knew some, not many, I knew some first-rank Holocaust historians, and they told me he was deported in 1944 from Hungary. That was one of the last deportations from Hungary. And he maybe passed through Auschwitz en route to a labor camp. That may have happened, according to the people I talked to. But there was clearly, I discuss it at some length in that little book. Wiesel figures not in a cameo role, but he has a major, he's a star of the Holocaust industry.
Yeah, I'm glad that I put Nicholas Gruner on your radar because he just knew the guy. He literally stole his identity. I mean, it's like it's a crazy.
I remember,
he knew him because obviously when you're in a camp together, and he was like just so excited to re-meet this someone who had this experience with him and described the march, everything. And
Candace is bringing up a good point. Stolen identity is a lot more common than people realize. And especially if you're going to steal anybody's identity, why not steal somebody's identity that could help make you very wealthy? And so Wiesel did, probably as effectively as anybody, stole the identity, likely. Again, I'm going based on what Norman's saying, for political and economic gain. I mean, it's that simple. So does that really surprise anybody? I mean, we know that Zionism is built on a lie. Why not compound it even more and have it built off of the backs of those that were mass murdered? Makes a lot of sense, guys.
The soles of his feet, and he just was like, what he did was the real person wrote the manuscript, and this gypsy just took on his identity. And when he describes that moment of being on the plane, what am I going to say to him? Like, we haven't seen each other. And then, like, could you imagine being confronted and going, wait a second, you're not Norm Finkelstein. You're not Norm. That is, and he said, but he had cameras ready and they like shook hands. And then he even said, what's even crazier is the real Holocaust survivor spoke Hungarian.
Well, that is
and Elie couldn't speak Hungarian at this time when this happened. And so he says to him, let's speak in English. It's just an incredible thing to comprehend that. And I think the best that I can guess is that you had these psychopaths, like, true Bolshevik psychopaths who were like, well, we can't just walk in and be like, well, I was just kind of running the Bolshevik camp over here, mass murdering Christians. So what better way to reintroduce yourself into society than to be like, I'm the ultimate victim. I survived the Auschwitz camp. I think that's what happened. I think they laundered they laundered through, and that's why there's so much confusion. And people are like, you're denying that people died here, because there's some people that are like, well, nothing ever happened, and it's like, no, something definitely. You read this guy Nicholas Gruner, and you're like, this happened. And there are some people who never lived a day in their lives of that, and I say Elie Wiesel is one of them, who took their personalities, took their identities, full on gypsy.
So if you want to understand how Zionism came to be, and like I said, it was a fantastic podcast. To Candace's credit, and obviously she wanted to share her thoughts, she gave Norman air for the most part to say what he needed to say, which was very important. And again, her audience has already seen this. Almost 1 million people have already seen the interview, and it happened just last night. And of all the segments of their conversation that I thought was vital above all others was the conversation about Elie Wiesel and how the whole concept of stolen valor, if you want to call it that, stolen identity, it's a hallmark of the whole Zionist concept. So when they are so vehemently talking about 6 million Jews and this and that, in reality, it's a story that they created on their own. So many of these people were not actually survivors, because as Norman points out, not a lot of people actually survived the Holocaust. But as he jokes, it became a cottage industry, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. If it's so profitable, people are going to claim that that was their, their background, even if it wasn't. It's paid off for so many people. Zionism has been extremely profitable and effective for a very long time. And this is in many ways one of the hallmarks of how it became so powerful in our culture. But hopefully not for much longer. As we can see, it's just a construct. It's just created. Wiesel's just one example, but there are many others out there. So it is incumbent upon us to do what we have to do to ensure that Zionism will be destroyed once and for all. And so that the true memories of the Jewish people that were mass murdered during the Holocaust can finally rest in peace.